welcome to another episode of my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. My name is Caitlin and I'll be your hostess. I have been doing living history for 12 plus years and I've been a seamstress / sewer since I was 8 years old, so it's been over 20 years at this point. This podcast explores things such as historical wardrobes, clothing, basically anything to do with clothing and women's lives within mostly the 19th century, occasionally the 20th century as well. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I'd love it if you consider following along by subscribing so you're notified anytime new episodes are published. Last time we discussed the research tools that I use, and this week we're going to kind of go back into my myth-busting video that we did on the YouTube channel, and we talked a lot about being poor in the 19th century and what that looks like clothing-wise and the misconceptions that people have in looking poor. And so now what we're going to do is go into that even further. We debunked 3 specific myths about looking poor. This time we're just going to go into how to look poor in the mid-19th century for a woman. And we're going to specifically do 1830 to 1870. And this is because I see a lot of people doing poor wrong. So without further ado, let's get started. So why on earth are we even talking about this? Who needs notes about looking poor when doing living history? Isn't that easy to do? Well, you think so, but I see so many people doing it wrong that I feel like we need to talk about it. I see an awful lot of really bad clothing choices being justified as, well, I'm portraying someone poor, so they would have just worn whatever they could get their hands on, which I understand to a point. But what they couldn't get their hands on would be a poly cotton permanent crinkle elastic skirt with white western style blouse with a bra and biker shorts underneath. So it has to be what they could have gotten their hands on in the mid-19th century. It has to be what they got their hands on within mid-19th century parameters. And also we have to take into who is really poor, what access people had to things, how the worldview and therefore how things were done was different back then, etc. And so there are a lot of facets to this conversation that I don't see a lot of living historians taking into consideration. So first of all, we need to determine what being poor means. How do you know you're poor? I know a lot of people who are like, oh, well, I portray a farmer, or a farmer's wife or whatever, and just leave it at that. So farmers aren't always poor, okay? The Gross family of Hempstead, Texas, owned 64,000 acres of land, 120 slaves, countless cattle, sheep, and horses, and were the wealthiest people in Texas in the 1850, but the Grosses still called themselves farmers on the census. Were some farmers poor? Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to see people stop using the I'm a farmer excuse as an excuse to just wear whatever they want to wear, whether it's accurate or not. I mean, at the very least, can we say that, hey, I'm a farmer and all my crops died due to the drought last year, and so we're like barely hanging on to the farm, and if we lose this year's crops, the bank is going to come take the farm. At least do something a little bit more realistic to justify the fact you have no money. Also, yes, America was very largely still a very agricultural society in the mid-19th century, but by the mid-19th century, we are well into the Industrial Revolution, and there are people living in towns in a less rural environment who are still poor. So you don't have to be a farmer to be poor. You can also be rich and be a farmer. What do you know? It's almost like the past wasn't black and white. There was a lot of gray within history and especially within society. Clerks and bookkeepers, for example, were often described themselves as being poor. Anna Alcott Pratt, sister of Louisa May Alcott, yes, the author of Little Women, kept a diary after she was married in 1860. Her husband was a bookkeeper employed in town, and the couple was not very well off, although they could afford the necessities. Mrs. Pratt does refer to themselves as poor, but never impoverished. What she does describe her childhood home as being in poverty. So she makes a distinction there that I don't think we consider when we talk about portraying poor people. And I kind of see this a lot in the 19th century. There is poor, which means you can afford to have the necessities, but you don't have anything extra. And then there's poverty, where you often struggle to make ends meet and are often without a stable home. And then there's destitute, in which in that case you were often in a poorhouse or on the streets. So just a little bit of distinction there, and sometimes you'll find historical references mesh the terms a little bit like we do today. It doesn't, it means it's different things to different people, but that's kind of how I distinguish it in my brain. And I see an overarching trend of those terms meaning those things through most people. So Mrs. Pratt in January of 1861 writes, quote, I heard today from home that poor mother had a sick turn, which much alarmed them all. And though there is now no danger, it caused me some hours of homesickness, and had I been rich enough, I should have gone home immediately." End quote. So the basics of life, food, shelter, and clothing, were met within the Pratt family. But there was not any extra money for excess travel, although in the next entry she does talk about going to Boston to see her sister-in-law, but also to run errands. So I guess that was a dual-purpose trip. Mrs. Pratt I do enjoy because I find her very relatable, and she doesn't care for housework as much as she thinks she should. And this is a complete aside, but I want to quote it, and it is my podcast, so I may do as I please. Quote, "Another weak spot in my nature, according to wise women, a house in its orderly keeping ought to be my greatest delight, but alas, alas, I did not inherit that blessed disposition that riseth not above pots and pans, and I detest cooking stoves, wash tubs, and scrubbing brushes. I love to work, but not to delve." End quote. She's also an introvert, saying, quote, "I hate to go anywhere, to see anybody, and only want to stay at home and have John all I can get him. People don't interest me, and beyond my own family, I don't care to see or know anyone. Several traits in my character are unfortunate for poor John, who is so social and jolly. I wish to be more like him in that respect." End quote. Isn't it always like the introvert marrying the extrovert? Even way back then. Anyway, Mr. Pratt earns himself $500 a year at his bookkeeping business. Mrs. Pratt does some odd sewing jobs, although she hates sewing, just to earn a little bit of extra money for herself. And she writes, quote, "I have a great idea lately of earning money, and I am so delighted to receive the least bit. It is the only money I take the least satisfaction in spending, for I don't like to use John's hard-earned pennies, though I think it delights him to give them to me. I love pretty things, but I hate to spend the money for them, and having always been poor, I can easily go without." End quote. She also says, quote, "There is a great deal of pleasure in earning one's own things." End quote. And we might hear critters in the background. I apologize. They both just had breakfast, and so now they're like, "Oh, I am fed. I want the human's attention now." And this is not the time for that, unfortunately. I will go cuddle them when I'm done here. If they really cared, they could come over here and get pets. So although at $500 a year, they have a modest, although very small and not fashionable house, decent food, and respectable clothing, including silk dresses, y'all. Her parents were impoverished, and yet she still took into her married life, her wedding wardrobe, as she termed it, 14 dresses, including a silk, 2 wools, 4 muslins, 5 calicos, a wrapper, and something she termed a mud gown, which I will have to further research later. Her parents couldn't even afford housing a lot of the time, which is why they moved 22 times in a 30-year period. But this young lady had 14 dresses in her poor woman's wardrobe. I need that to sink in for everyone for a moment, please. Also, she doesn't mention it in her wedding wardrobe, but she also does have a gray riding habit. And the only reason I know that is because she mentions on her wedding day, she puts on her white dress to appear as a bride, and then decides she is not young nor pretty enough to wear white. And so she decides to get married in her gray riding habit. And that is the reason I know she has one of those. So when she actually listed out all the things she carried into her marriage, her wedding wardrobe, she missed her riding habit. So I guess there is a possibility she missed other things too. Now the Pratt couple still considers themselves poor, making $500 a year, but let's take into account that in their general area, a female servant was making roughly $77 a year in 1850 on average, but that rate did include board, so she would only have to pay for clothing and then once, because her room and her food were already taken care of. Without board, a male day laborer, so low class still, was earning just under $400 a year in the same area at the same time. And that accounts for the fact that he is male and therefore earning a little bit more, and also doing harder, more physical labor, and is not having room and board provided. So yes, he is making quite a bit more. With board, the same male laborer would make just over $300 a year, so there's about a $100 difference within that. A farmhand in the same area that Mrs. Pratt lived would make about, and this is with board, would earn about $163 a year. And that varied by state, of course, and area based on the cost of living. So just saying that I earn $500 a year and calling yourself poor doesn't work. Just saying I earn only $100 a year and saying that I'm poor doesn't work. $500 in certain areas of the U.S. was a really good wage, and it was way below poverty in other places in the U.S. So you do have to know what the average wages are in your area to decide if you actually are poor. I would say that the Pratt family is, yes, still working class, but I would say they're most likely upper working class, given the fact they have a stable home, given the fact they have at least $500 a year. They have necessities. So yes, working class, but I would say upper working class, maybe middle working class. So for instance, California had a very high cost of living. So that same farmhand that in Massachusetts was earning $163 a year would earn in California $720 in a year with board. In Georgia, that same profession earned just $100 a year, and in Texas, $144 a year. So saying the number isn't good enough. You have to know your area and what professions were making on average to know really what was normal in that area. And all of this is relative to what those people spend as well. For instance, the report of Special Commissioner in the Revenue of the year 1868 lists for us what the average earnings were for families as well as what they spent. So parents with a single child earned on average $728 across America in 1867. They on average spent $532.48 on food and housing, leaving $351.52 for the year of clothing, household goods, etc. So going back up to the Pratt example, they were making $500 in 1861. The average household income for a couple with a single child, and there was no option for just a couple in our lovely reports here. So I went with a couple with a single child because I felt that was closest to what they were. So you're just going to bear with me for a bit. So the average income in 1860, which is the year that Mrs. Pratt is writing her diary, was $632.84. So the Pratts are under the national average, especially considering they seem to live in somewhat of a high income area. They probably are poor in the most general sense of the word. The average family of parents with one child are spending $17.92 in just necessities of rent, clothing, food, and household goods a year more than the Pratts were even earning at all. So you have to think of that because the Pratts live far away from family. They are having to live on their own, which is an extra expense. In the very high cost of living areas such as California, I personally see an uptick in multifamily households such as Carrie Williams' family, and we discussed her a lot in some previous myth-busting videos. But she has a 3-bedroom house that houses Carrie, her husband, her toddler, her mother and father-in-law, as well as her sister and brother-in-law. And you see multifamily households in other areas as well. Now, we don't know what the Williams earned as a family unit, but we do know that Carrie keeps a debt to the local secondhand merchant, which her husband does occasionally pay off. And at one point, they do have to sell off a piano for the extra money. And Carrie was upset about that, not because she was upset about losing the piano, but because she did not get the price she felt it was worth and what she paid for it back east. Now, of course, you don't have to live in multifamily households. You could, other families did live on their own. Sometimes they were so close to family and sometimes they were far away. But even within that sphere, they would have had either purchased a home, be renting a home, or be building their own home on land that they purchased or were given as part of a land grant. And besides that, there are still single adults who, if they aren't buying, renting, or building, are living in a boarding situation. Some married couples live in boarding situations in the mid-19th century. And all that adds in another facet of believability, if you will, to the person that you are portraying within living history. It is not enough to say that you are poor. I found that if I say that to a museum visitor, their next question is often, well, how much do you make in a year? Because that's something they don't understand about 19th century life and they would like to know. And I feel that with you saying that you are poor, that is a very valid next question. By saying that, I put the idea of money into their head. So there's no use fumbling our way around those questions. You ought to know them beforehand to at least have a general idea. And the issue further expounds itself, being that some professions that we consider to make very good and wealthy livings today perhaps did not do so in the 19th century. For instance, doctors could be very well set off in life in the mid-19th century, but a lot were not. A doctor who served local plantations or wealthy town folks could earn a lot more than a doctor in the country who may be accepting chickens as payment for services. It would also depend on how large the community that they reside in happened to be, whether they are generally healthy or ill, and how many doctors are in the general area. For instance, Godey's Lady's Book of 1847, we get the story of Lydia Leeson, whose father is a poor doctor. And why is he poor? Because Hazel Ridge, the area which he practiced, was a generally healthy community. And his best patients were a hypochondriac and a lonely widower. In fact, the doctor and his family were kept afloat by, quote, 3 nervous ladies and 4 dystopic gentlemen and Mr. Henshaw, end quote, who was the aforementioned widower. We do not know what Dr. Leeson earned in a year, But we do know it was meager, and even though it is stressed how little money he did have, we do know that he did not pay rent or a mortgage, as he lived in a home that he inherited. So with shelter taken care of, the only real necessities being left are food and clothing. Lydia sets her heart on a silk dress, as apparently all the young ladies in Hazel Ridge are wearing them, no matter what their station, and so she sews shirts for her uncle to earn herself a silk dress. Now, the silk dress does not turn out well, and the moral of the story is not to spend money on foolish things, but don't let anyone tell you that poor people cannot afford silk dresses. We see now 2 examples of women in a poor station of life owning silk dresses. And actually, if we go back to Carrie Williams, that could be a 3rd one. She also owned a few silk dresses, and she was way out west in California. We're not even counting the fact that you don't even have to buy that silk dress new. You could buy it from a second-hand merchant or a shop in a bazaar type setting, and those could be very common in the mid-19th century, in which you could get a cast-off silk dress for relatively cheap and then remake it in the latest style to fit you, and therefore you would have a silk dress. And again, what was considered poor very much depended on where you lived, how much things cost, what the average wage in that area was, etc. And no, you don't have to know everything about your persona when doing living history, and that's highly overwhelming to know everything. But you should have a general idea, not only about what your family unit consists of and what they would be making financially and what your general living situation is, but also how changing your living situation would change how comfortably you could live, and in regards to where you live, what your place in society is, etc. Also, is your income dependent on the weather? And so as a farmer, yes, I would suggest looking back on weather patterns and crop situations in your area in that year before you start saying, oh, we're poor because the crops died because of drought. Please make sure that's true first, and don't forget that if you've had a bumper crop, say 3 years ago, you probably had some nice things left over from that year that could be scrimped and saved and used. Now, we can even further expand on the facet of being poor if we begin looking at the truly poor, the impoverished, surviving on charity or living in poorhouses or even in prisons, but there isn't typically a space to interpret people of that level, so I don't think it's conducive to our conversation here today, although I do think it is an interesting point of study. Now, we have looked on in other myth-busting videos, when we even looked at what poor people were wearing, even in poorhouses, we still see them wearing respectable clothing. We see them wearing chemises, corsets, a petticoat, and a dress, and a bonnet, at the very least. So yes, even the poor people, very, very poor, were still wearing corsets. In fact, we learned in, I think it was 2 myth-busting videos ago, that there was a quote about poor people, even when they are completely destitute and their clothes hang about them rags, are still wearing stays underneath despite their circumstances. So I do want to put it in here real quick that just because you are poor does not mean you're not wearing a corset. You are still wearing corsets. So now that we have taken somewhat of a brief and surface level look at who is actually poor in the 19th century, we now get to start talking about looking poor. And the very first thing we need to do is to stop looking at the 19th century through 20th and 21st century rose-colored glasses. We have these ideals of people who are ragged and tattered, trudging through the West to make a better living for themselves. But even when we have sources saying that people in certain areas were ragged, we still have to look at that through 19th century lenses. What did the 19th century consider to look ragged? It may not be as rough and patchy as we would like to believe today. In fact, when you look through extant sources from areas out west and in general away from polite society, as it were, you often see visitors coming from back east over and over saying, basically, I was expecting to come out here in the armpits of civilization, but look, people here look normal. They dress like we do back east, and they have a few quirks here and there, but overall they act civilized, and I was not expecting this. And yes, I'm paraphrasing because that's not the terms the 19th century people would use. They use terms that are far more eloquent in language than I do. In fact, even in Texas in the 1830s and 40s, which yes, in a lot of ways there were some backwoodsman things going on, to an extent, but people from back east were still coming over and saying, oh wow, they're fashionable. They're wearing fashions from New Orleans. Look at that. We often like to pretend, or at least we imagine, that there were supply chain issues pre-1870. In reality, there really weren't. Dallas County here in Texas was getting fancy things like cook stoves and fabrics in the 1850s at not much higher prices than they were getting them back east in Philadelphia. And they were only taking a couple weeks to get here. In 1858, Carrie Williams, which we talked about before, notes that on the 1st of December, the December issue of Godey's Ladies' Book arrived for her reading pleasure. And it has up-to-date fashions with what all the fancy people are wearing, new stories, crafts and projects, house plans, etc. Yes, most people back east were getting the Godey's book a week or two before the first of the month, but rural California in 1858 wasn't more than a week or two behind in getting the things of that nature. Here in America especially, you do not see the supply chain issues that you would expect. They were actually really good at getting things that they thought were important. And most people today don't expect that. That's why it's so important to go back to the original sources and to stop relying on things that we know. Because I'm telling you that beyond important people and wars, 95% of common history knowledge is wrong. I read college books that were extremely wrong in the facts that they were spilling out, and it only took a 5-minute search on advanced Google books, searching through literature from the 19th century to show strong evidence to the contrary of what that college textbook was saying. So yes, I am still slightly salty about my college English course where the textbook says that Victorians were so prude that they covered the legs of their furniture because legs were too immodest to be seen even if it was furniture legs. And you couldn't show ankles and you couldn't say words like breast or thigh without being impolite and immoral. Nowhere is that a thing. Okay, actually the table leg thing was a thing in a certain school. That was only one school it was documented. It was an English traveler going to visit that school. And the only reason he mentioned it is because he thought it was crazy. He documented it because this is ridiculous. These women are covering furniture legs because they think it's immodest. What kind of weirdness is this? And things like this are a large reason about why I advocate for research specifically on primary documents. Because what we often expect is usually not what happened. And so going back to not looking the 19th century through the 20th or 21st century nostalgia, we are trying to not look like a Wizard of Oz character. There are no patchwork girls here. If you start looking at images of the 19th century people in the wild, so to speak, you don't see obvious patches. You don't see mismatched outfits of a different top and bottom. You don't generally see people corsetless just because they're out west or roughing it on a farm. You see put together people working their tails off to survive. You see them in corsets, in layers of petticoats, or in hoops during that time period. You see them in one-piece dresses, plain sunbonnets, presentable aprons, dressed hair with rolled up sleeves and pinned back skirts. You see them being presentable, even on their own farms doing labor or traveling in a wagon train. They are not slovenly and unkempt. They are still trying to appear respectable, because that is how you are accepted into society back in the 19th century. You had to be respectable, and that included not only your manners, but also how you dressed. Another pitfall that I often see lady living historians fall into is the, well, I'm portraying someone poor, but she wants to be fashionable, so I can take this fashion plate and I can make it up in the cheap homespun cotton I found at Walmart. Because they would have just bought what they could afford and they would have made it fashionable. Which again is using 20th and 20th century thinking and trying to shove it into a 19th century hole. That is like taking a beautiful 1,000 piece puzzle featuring a quaint countryside and trying to shove a wooden toddler farm animal puzzle piece in there saying, hey look, it fits. You're not taking into account that certain styles had to be made up in certain materials. Yes, there were styles and trimmings that were only made up in silk and wool dresses. There were certain styles that you had to have access to nice materials. Taking the infamous white blouse and skirt combo that we see at a lot of reenactments. It is absolutely wrong for that outfit to be worn in any type of working class situation, unless it is as their best outfit, and even then, I don't see that style on a lot of poor women. It's a very fashion-forward ensemble. You still see that most working class women on their best dress is going to be 99% of the time a one-piece dress, just in nicer fabrics. And I go into more detail in the myth-busting video. That is not a blouse, it is a bodice or a waist. It is made of very sheer, very fine, and often very expensive cotton or silk, and is only worn with a silk, wool, or very fine and sheer skirt. It is a style that we see become popular in the middle of the American Civil War, so I would struggle with its authenticity before 1863 anyway. You cannot take that outfit and turn it into a working class outfit. It is a very fashion-forward outfit and would only be attainable if you had the funds for it, but also the inclination to have the very next new thing. Now we do see sacks and petticoats in the mid-19th century version of the short gown for working wear. That can be great for an at-home form of undress when one is not expecting visitors and in their own home. It's similar to wearing a wrapper. Now what I struggle with as a living historian is, do I wear something that I wouldn't necessarily ever be seen in within the 19th century context to receive modern visitors? Do I treat them as guests and therefore would not wear that? Or would I pretend that they don't actually exist and wear my at-home wear despite the guest? And I think part of that answer is, are you in first person talking to them as if you are in the 19th century, or are you in third person where you're talking about what people in the 19th century did, just dressed out? Because I think you can get away with it more within third person, because you could say, I normally would never be seen in this because I am at home and not expecting visitors. I'm wearing it to get work done, which you can technically do in first person, but it would require a fair bit of acting and being stressed and overly apologetic about the visitors seeing you in that state. And at some level, it would make the average visitor very uncomfortable in that situation. So that's something I struggle with sacks and petticoats as working wear within the living history context. Although I do love them, I think they're fun. They also do seem to be way more common in England than they are in America, which is something I'm trying to research further, especially if they're mismatched. I see a lot of mismatched sacks and petticoats in England, whereas in America, almost inevitably, the sack and petticoat are of the same fabric, which I think is an interesting thing, and I have not further researched that to see if that was actually a thing, or if it's just my small sample size that is showing that. But it's something that's in the back of my brain that I am going to try to research further. And of course, most living historians like to wear the mismatched look, because I think in our brains, it still looks better to be mismatched. It looks poor, in our opinion. Now again, sacks and petticoats can also be great maternity wear, same as wrappers. And in that case, you could be seen in front of people with it. If you're expecting, you get to disregard certain rules of clothing. But at that point, it would be a little bit more of a fancier outfit, typically, and it wouldn't be so unsightly for others. And the same outfit, that sack and petticoat, does get remade over for like recreational wear, for hiking, but also for traveling, and sometimes for skating as well. So it's not the outfit itself that is unfashionable and unsightly, it's more of what material it's made in and what context it is worn. But then other than that instance, the poor woman's dress is likely going to be a one-piece dress, and that's the best thing to stick to in regards to making up reproduction clothing. So for the very end, I do want to go over a common excuse for wearing just whatever I want to for a living history event, and that is often it's too expensive to do it right. And it can be, it absolutely can be. But it doesn't have to be as long as you have a bit of determination. And fortunately, because we are portraying poor people in this instance, it means that we do not have to get the expensive accessories. So let's budget this out, shall we? Now, of course, if you're just going to need a fun outfit for a costume for a party, or just something that your friends are getting done, of course you don't need all the layers. You go to Amazon and buy a pioneer costume. It's fine. No one's going to say anything. This is for living historians, so I don't want to see in the comments people getting upset with me about thinking I'm snobby and putting down costumers. Costumers are in their own category. As long as you're not at a living history event, I don't care what you wear. But for anyone who's in a museum or living history setting, basically anyone who's putting themselves out there to the public does need to be dressed accurately. There is no excuse. The general public already has enough misconceptions about 19th century life and other time periods as well. They don't need you adding to the myths. And I can hear you going over there, oh, it's fine, the public doesn't know any better, as excusing laziness. That's part of the problem, okay? They don't know any better because no one has taught them. That's our job as living historians. So let's look at how cheaply we can get a basic outfit put together. And you can absolutely do it cheaper than what I'm putting here. This is the prices I could find in my area without going to Goodwill or thrifting dress fabrics. I did show some how you can thrift, and you can make it even cheaper. But I wanted to make this accessible to everyone, and no one telling me, oh, you can't do that, I found we can't get those prices at Goodwill. So I'm trying to do online sources where everyone in the US at least can get these prices. So starting with underpinnings, chemise, drawers, and petticoats, you can get a free draft it yourself patterns from Elizabeth Stewart Clark's website. Her website is www.thesewingacademy.com. It's an excellent resource for 1845 to about 1870. If you're doing earlier, I would use the Workwoman's Guide, which was published in 1838. The directions are not as user-friendly, but I have videos on how to do most of the things. And you can get that book free on Google Books. You can also order reprints from Amazon, but it's free if you get it from Google Books and just print it out. So that's patterns for 75% of your undergarments free. That's all your underpinnings except for your corset. So for fabric, you can buy bleached cotton muslin for $2 a yard at Joann's. It'll be the 36-inch wide fabric. If you can, get 25 yards, which will bump it down to $1.80 a yard. But that will last you for literal years of doing living history. You can use it for facings and underpinnings and other bits and bobs, neckerchiefs, collars, cuffs, if you have to. And that'll be $45 if you can afford it. If not, that's fine. Get at least 12 yards, if not 15. So at $2 a yard, let's go to the higher figure that will say $30. Now you can also do Facebook Marketplace or Goodwill and get those 100% white cotton sheets. Make sure it's 100% cotton and that it's a solid, printer paper white, not patterned or off-white or anything. And when I go to Facebook Marketplace, I see deals like double-sized queen sheets for $15. That'll get you chemise drawers and a petticoat. And you'll only need about 4 yards of muslin at $8 for a second petticoat. So that'll be $23 for most of your underpinnings, so you can save a few bucks there. Corsets are where it gets a little tricky. This will likely be the most expensive article of clothing that you'll purchase. If you join a historical costumer de-stash page or get on a Facebook group that allows sales, you can find some quality used corsets for like $50. If you're making your own, it'll be a little bit more expensive. It's a bit closer to $100 if you're doing it from scratch. And that I would suggest only if you cannot find a used corset already. So if you're making one up for your own, get 1 yard of cotton twill or sateen from Joann's. If you have the extra funds, I would definitely splurge on coutil, but that's optional. I did not get a coutil corset until last year, and I've been doing this for over 12, 14 years. So it's not a necessity. A sateen will run you on sale about $10 a yard, which is what it is when I'm filming this. And cotton twill is about $8.50 on sale. So let's just say $10. I find for cheapness, lining your corsets is a good option. With the white cotton you got earlier, just using scraps of it is a really good option, so we don't have to add cost for lining. If you did an unlined corset, you would have to add the bone casing to that cost, but if you line it and you do it with your fabric you already have and just the scraps of it, it's free. For boning, you have two options. You can do spring steel, which you can get from Amazon. It will be cheaper from a corset supply store, or German plastic whalebone, which is which you can also get from a corset supply store, and I really suggest that. It's really nice and it's really cheap too. You can also get a corset busk there. You'll need approximately 5 yards of lacing for your corset and grommets. My suggestion is that you make up your pattern first without boning, do a fitting, and then purchase your boning so you get the right size, especially if you're buying the steel boning. But so you want the white spring steel, or you want German plastic whalebone, which is different than just plastic whalebone you can buy on Amazon. You will still, even if you use a German plastic whalebone, you'll want at least one bone in each side of the very back, just for support, and you need to make sure you get the right size of that. So for a pattern, my very first well-made corset, I did draft myself from my measurements, but for most people, I would suggest a pattern for a corset. Red Threaded sells patterns for $20, and there are other good pattern companies that you can get some patterns from, like Past Patterns, for about that same price. So that's $10 for fabric, $6 for a busk, $12 for the 10 meters of boning, and that makes $28. Let's just say $35 because we got to add in some shipping in there. I don't think it would be that much, but we'll add it just to be safe. If you do the digital red threaded pattern that you print at home, your corset will come up to $90. I told you that would be the expensive part. Now, if you're doing 1830s, you can subtract some of that cost because you don't need the metal grommets. You can do hand done or bone eyelets. Bone eyelets are expensive, so we'll do them hand done for this example. And that saves us $24 right there. We also need to substitute the metal busk for a $14 straight busk from Etsy. And you can also factor out the boning and just do peaches and cream yarn instead, which will put you at $2 for Walmart. So an 1830s corset, which you could probably push into the mid 1840s, would come out to $70 instead of $90. So if you're keeping track, that so far we're at $113 for mid-19th century, and then also $93 for the 1830s. For footwear, stockings could be had for $14 to $16 a pair from Etsy or Samson Historical or Burnley and Trowbridge. If you're thinking you'll be around a fire at all, I would highly recommend going to Burnley and Trowbridge, picking up a pair of light cotton stockings, and also grabbing 2 yards of their wool stuff in lieu of getting 4 extra yards of Joann's muslin for that second petticoat. So if you're getting fabric from Joann's, I would subtract 4 yards for that second petticoat of whatever you bought, and then instead get this wool. Wool is naturally flame retardant, making it safer to be around a fire. And it won't make you hotter at all, I promise. Dress weight wool from the 18th and 19th century is amazing. It won't make you hot. It'll be a little bit more expensive than doing the white cotton petticoats, but it will be safer. And if you're doing any type of cold weather events, while you're already there, if you can afford it, go ahead and pick up 2 more yards of wool for a shawl. And you can sometimes get those 2 yard links from like eBay because they're sold as remnants or bolt ends, and you can get them for like $9 to $10 a yard. But you just have to buy the whole bolt. It might be 2 3/4 yard, or it may be a yard and 3/4. Get at least 2 yards, I would say. And if you could find a bolt end for like 4 or 5 yards, do that, because then you can use it for a shawl, you can use it for a petticoat. You may have enough to squeak by with an under petticoat if it gets really cold. I would do as much as you can afford. I would do that. Shoes are going to be another expensive purchase, and it's handy to belong to, again, some de-stash groups to get them cheap. If you can find a square-toed leather ankle boots that lace up the front or side, or even have elastic on the sides with minimal heel, you can use those until you save up. So I find that you can find some general shoes that look decent enough for $30 if you really look for them. Walmart actually has some very passable slippers for $10 a pair that would work until you could afford better shoes. And I still saw them there a few months ago at my Walmart. So now for the clothing. My first well-made dress was a 100% cotton duvet cover in a period blue plaid for $5. And you can actually get some cheap stuff, at thrift stores for that. Let's say that's unattainable nowadays. Hancock's of Paducah, www.thousandsofbolts.com, and www.quiltedtwins.com have reproduction cotton prints for $7 a yard or less, and most people use about 7 yards for a dress. Remember that piecing is period, so again, we're trying to do this as cheaply as possible. I'm plus size, and I can get a dress out of about 6 to 6.5 yards, doing 44 inch wide fabric without piecing. I have gotten dress out of 5 yards before for my size, but I'm also like 5'4", so I'm not super tall. So let's just say 7 yards just to be safe so you don't have to piece. They'll get most people a nice cotton dress. So let's say $55 for a dress to include shipping. So while you're shopping, you may as well pick up a yard of cotton for a sunbonnet and 2 yards of cotton for an apron. Again, unless you can do a thrift store and get cheaper prices for that. Or unless you have enough white cotton left over, you can make your apron out of the white cotton. So let's just say we're going to use the extra white cotton for a apron, and we're just going to need dress fabric and sunbonnet fabric. So let's just say $60 for that. I do have draft your own pattern tutorials here on YouTube. I have an 1830s one and an 1850s and 60s one. And then Elizabeth Stewart Clark also has articles on fitting. She has a free shawl pattern, free sunbonnet patterns, a free apron pattern. Anna Warden Bowersmith has an excellent article on how to make yourself a neckerchief. So that all that is free for you to use, and I would do that for working class in lieu of a collar because you have a free pattern for that. If you really want to do collar, you absolutely can. I actually have a how to draft your own collar pattern as well. So I'll link all of these resources for you below. So to put it all together, a very basic outfit would include chemise, drawers, although you can get away without drawers entirely up through about 1860. So if you don't feel like you have to have something there for coverage, do without them. That saves you some money. Saves you about 2 yards of fabric actually. A corset, stockings, and shoes, 2 petticoats, either 2 white ones or a white one and a wool one over top, a dress, an apron, a sunbonnet, and a neckerchief. With the numbers that I provided, that comes out to $197, which is on the expensive side. So you can do that much cheaper if you go the thrift store route, as we've already discussed. And so yeah, $197 is expensive, but that will get you a very solid outfit for yourself. If that's too unattainable, what I would suggest is to go find an event in your area, locate a group that looks like they know what they're doing, and I know that's hard for beginners, but they need to be wearing corsets, they need to be looking decent and put together, doing pour the right way as we've discussed in this video so far, and go sit with them and tell them you want to start doing living history and what they suggest. 9 times out of 10, I find that a lot of groups will scrounge you an outfit to wear for your first event, and then you can slowly build your wardrobe as you can find it or afford it. Sometimes they'll already have patterns that they can lend you, or have fabric they've bought super cheap that they'll sell you, or old pieces that no longer fit them that you can buy and then refit. Find yourself a local authentic group and they will help you find an alternative to that cost. And if you're insistent upon doing it for yourself, get really good at doing thrift stores. I've known people who recently have gotten their entire outfit, shoes included, for less than $100 because they thrifted everything. And that will just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my current research on poor people in the mid-19th century and looking poor in that time period. I had a lot of fun researching for this, and I look forward to doing more. Next episode, we will be looking into my struggle into finding a place within World War II living history, because yes, that has been a struggle for me. So be on the lookout for that episode in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me or find me on Instagram or YouTube under Caitlin Kearns. I hope you enjoyed this video of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. If you did, please leave a review on Spotify or YouTube and then share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to contact me to tell me what topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next video.